Dictatorship. In today's world, this word usually brings to mind places like North Korea, Turkmenistan, or even authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia. In the Americas, if someone asked you which is the biggest dictatorship on the continent, most would point to Nicolás Maduro's Venezuela or the Castro brothers' Cuba. But what if I told you that there is a country in the heart of Central America that, according to many analysts, is as closed as Cuba, as suffocating as Venezuela, and in some ways even comparable to North Korea? That country is called Nicaragua. And today on Bello Mundo, we're going to take you there to show you how one of the darkest dictatorships of all time works. Number 1. Location and geographical data. Nicaragua is located right in the heart of Central America. If you look at the map, it lies between Honduras to the north and Costa Rica to the south, with the waters of the Pacific Ocean on one side and the Caribbean Sea on the other. It is a relatively small country, covering about 50,000 square miles. To give you an idea, it is smaller than the state of Mississippi. But as we always say, size isn't everything, and although small, Nicaragua is home to some of the most beautiful landscapes in Central America. No wonder it is called the land of lakes and volcanoes. The territory is dotted with active volcanoes and craters that have turned into giant blue lakes. One of the postcard views is Lake Nicaragua, the largest in Central America. The curious thing is that it is home to freshwater sharks, a very rare phenomenon in the world. In addition to this, there are places such as Lake Managua, the Masaya volcano, which still emits smoke and can be visited by car right up to the edge of the crater, and the Ometepe Islands, formed by two volcanoes that rise from the middle of the lake. All this under a tropical climate, with rains from May to October and long periods of sunshine that favor crops such as cotton, coffee, sugarcane, and fruits. In other words, geographically, Nicaragua is one of those gems that could be a tourist paradise. But, as we will see later, behind these postcard landscapes lies a much harsher reality. Number 2. Population and language. Today, Nicaragua has just over 6.5 million inhabitants. It seems like a lot, but it's as if the entire population of Nicaragua could fit inside the state of Indiana. They are a diverse and warm people. About 69% identify as mestizos, the result of mixing between indigenous peoples and Europeans. 17% are direct descendants of Europeans, 5% still preserve their indigenous roots, and 9% are of African descent. The official language is Spanish, but history has left different marks on the Caribbean coast. Indigenous and Afro-descendant communities live there and still preserve their own languages. In addition, there is even an English Creole, a legacy of the time when the region was under British influence. Religion also helps to explain who Nicaraguans are. More than half of the population is Catholic, about 20% are Protestant, and the rest is divided between other Christian traditions and indigenous beliefs. Even the festivals reflect this cultural mix. In inland cities, Catholic processions predominate, but on the Caribbean coast, Parandas take center stage, popular festivals full of Afro-Caribbean music, drums, and colorful dances reminiscent of a tropical carnival. In the kitchen, the dish that is always present is gallo pinto, a simple mixture of rice and beans, which is the classic Nicaraguan breakfast. It is usually accompanied by vigorón, which is cooked cassava served with pork cracklings and a pickled cabbage salad. A typical street food, it is cheap, quick, and full of flavor. The result is a small country with an impressive cultural diversity, and it is precisely this diversity that helps us understand much of what would come later. including some of the most tense conflicts in the region, which paved the way for the rise of a central figure in recent history, Daniel Ortega. Number 3. History. To understand how Nicaragua arrived at its current state, we need to go back in time. The history of this small country is like a soap opera, full of disputes, invasions, and remarkable characters. Long before the arrival of Europeans, the region was already home to indigenous peoples such as the Nahuas and Corotegas, who cultivated corn, beans, and cacao. But this chapter would change in 1524, when the Spanish arrived led by Francisco Hernández de Córdoba, the conquistador who founded Granada and León, two cities that still dispute which is the most important. From then on, Nicaragua became a colony of Spain for almost 300 years. When the wave of independence swept through Latin America in 1821, Nicaragua also gained its freedom. But freedom here did not mean peace. Soon the country was divided in an endless feud between the liberals of León and the conservatives of Granada. This fight was so ugly that, in the mid-19th century, it opened the door for an unlikely character, an American adventurer named William Walker, who simply proclaimed himself President of Nicaragua. Yes, a gringo in power. Of course, it didn't last long, but it left a mark on how the country has always been vulnerable to outside influences. Time passed, but the instability continued. In the 20th century, another name would become synonymous with absolute power: Anastasio Somoza Garcia. In 1936, he staged a coup and inaugurated a dynasty that would rule Nicaragua as if it were family property. There were more than 40 years of authoritarianism, corruption, and violence, always with the endorsement of the United States, which saw the Somoza family as loyal allies in the midst of the Cold War. But nothing lasts forever. In 1979, after decades of abuse, the people's patience reached its limit, and thus the Sandinista National Liberation Front was born. The Sandinistas were inspired by Augusto Cesar Sandino, the guerrilla fighter who, in the 20s and 30s, fought against the U.S. military occupation. The promise was beautiful: social justice, freedom, and an end to the dictatorship. And it was during this revolution that the name Daniel Ortega first appeared. Number 4. Daniel Ortega. Daniel Ortega was born on November 11, 1945, in La Libertad, a small town in Nicaragua. He experienced imprisonment, exile, and training in Cuba. He was the typical revolutionary of his time. From an early age, he immersed himself in politics. In the 60s, while still a teenager, he joined the Sandinista National Liberation Front, the guerrilla group we mentioned earlier. When the Sandinista Revolution triumphed in 1979, Ortega was there. He rose quickly within the party and, in 1985, became president of Nicaragua. But governing would not be easy. The country was in the midst of the Cold War, and the United States did not want to see another government allied with Cuba and the Soviet Union in Central America. It was in this context that the Contras were born, armed groups financed by Washington to overthrow the Sandinistas. There followed years of civil war, violence, and misery. Ortega survived politically, but in 1990 he lost the elections and left power. It seemed like the end of his story. However, like a character who refuses to be taken off the stage, he continued to work behind the scenes. The 90s were a time of waiting and rapprochement. Ortega softened his rhetoric, swapped his military uniform for a suit and tie, and sold himself as a moderate politician. This change of image worked. In 2006, he returned to the presidency with a promise of dialogue and national reconciliation. However, from then on, the script took a different turn. Gradually, democracy gave way to a personalist project. In less than a decade, Ortega accumulated power, co-opted Congress, and filled the judiciary with allies. Constitutional amendments abolished term limits and paved the way for him to run for office indefinitely. In 2014, changes to the electoral law further reduced transparency. 2 years later, with no real opponents in the race, Ortega was re-elected and chose his wife, Rosario Murillo, as vice president. In practice, Nicaragua was now ruled by a duo. Together, they took control of virtually everything: the police, the judiciary, parliament, the press, and even universities. The country that once dreamed of freedom after the fall of the Somoza regime was plunging into another dictatorship, perhaps even more suffocating. In April 2018, the contradictions exploded. Social security reforms increased contributions and reduced pensions, sparking student protests that quickly spread. The response was brutal. Police and militias fired on unarmed protesters. UN reports indicate that more than 350 people were killed between April and September of that year, while hundreds were tortured and thousands were arrested without due process. Armed paramilitaries made up of former military personnel and civilians linked to the government acted side by side with the police. The newspaper El País highlighted that these groups used AK-47 and Dragunov rifles to shoot protesters directly in the head, neck, and chest in an act of violence classified by experts as a crime against humanity. From then on, repression ceased to be the exception and became the rule. Today, Ortega is seen by many as one of the most authoritarian leaders on the planet. For some analysts, Nicaragua has already reached levels of repression comparable, or even worse, than Cuba, and dangerously close to North Korea. Number 5. Tropical North Korea. If there were still any doubts about the nature of Daniel Ortega's regime, the last few years have dispelled them. Since 2018, Nicaragua has become practically an open-air prison. To give you an idea, in February 2023, the government released 222 political prisoners at once. The news seemed positive, but there was a cruel catch. They were all put on planes and sent to the United States with no right to return. On the same day, the National Assembly approved a change to the Constitution that allowed the citizenship of these opponents to be revoked. In other words, not only were they expelled, but they also ceased to be Nicaraguans in the eyes of the law. A few days later, another 94 people suffered the same fate. This is just a sample. It is estimated that more than 300 people were killed in the repression of the protests in 2018. Thousands were arbitrarily arrested, and hundreds remain behind bars to this day, often without a fair trial. Reports of physical and psychological abuse, and even sexual violence against detainees are part of the dossiers of international organizations. The persecution also extends to other sectors. The Catholic Church, for example, has become a direct target. Priests have been arrested, processions banned, and universities linked to religious orders closed. The most shocking case was that of Bishop Rolando Alvarez, sentenced to 26 years in prison simply for criticizing the regime. Even the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, was expelled from the country in 2023 with all its assets confiscated. The repression also affected the press. Newspapers were closed, broadcasters invaded, journalists arrested or forced into exile. Between 2018 and 2023, more than 1,300 attacks against journalists and independent media outlets were documented. Today, virtually all media within the country is under government control or silenced by fear. Not even education has escaped. Universities considered critical were simply closed, and others came under the control of pro-government agencies. Teachers are pressured to indoctrinate students with Sandinista propaganda, and students who dare to protest are persecuted. And if you think that people can at least organize themselves into associations or NGOs, the answer is no. In 2023 alone, the government closed more than 3,000 non-governmental organizations, including even support groups for cancer patients. The result is a country that is increasingly isolated, poor, and without prospects for freedom. No wonder more than 150,000 Nicaraguans have fled to neighboring Costa Rica since 2018. Nicaragua, which could be remembered for its volcanoes, lakes, and beaches, is now remembered for the flight of its own people, for censorship, and for fear. It is the cruel picture of a dictatorship in the 21st century. Number 6. International isolation. With all this repression, it didn't take long for Nicaragua to become the target of criticism and sanctions. The European Union and the United States tightened the noose, froze the assets of officials linked to the regime, and banned travel by figures close to Ortega. But instead of backing down, Ortega closed himself off even more. In 2022, the government broke off relations with the Vatican after accusations of religious persecution. During the same period, even Brazil, which traditionally maintains dialogue and, at times, even flirts with authoritarian governments, decided to distance itself. The trigger came when Ortega expelled the Brazilian ambassador from Managua because he did not participate in the celebrations of the Sandinista revolution. Lula reacted immediately. He recalled the Nicaraguan ambassador to Brasilia and began to publicly criticize the regime. It was a clear sign that if even Brazil had broken ties, Ortega was becoming increasingly isolated on the continent. Today, Ortega's closest partners are Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. This list speaks volumes about how the country has positioned itself on the global stage. With so many control mechanisms in place, it is no exaggeration to say that Nicaragua is living in a Caribbean dystopia. Freedom House classifies the country as not free, giving it only 14 points out of 100 on its index of political and civil liberties. Analysts say the regime mixes traits of old Latin American autocracies with totalitarian elements worthy of North Korea. A cult of personality, with posters of Ortega and Murillo scattered throughout the squares, constant surveillance, a controlled economy, and an almost total blockade of information. The Miami Herald reinforced the comparison by calling the new constitution, approved in 2025, a manual of repression. Among other points, the text defines Nicaragua as a revolutionary nation based on socialist ideals and limits freedom of expression to content that does not criticize the government. The balance sheet is grim. Since 2018, more than 350 protesters have been killed, more than 5,000 NGOs, many linked to the Catholic Church, have been shut down, and more than 450 opponents have lost their citizenship and been deported. It is no exaggeration, therefore, when dissidents describe Nicaragua as a country worse than North Korea. The difference is that, unlike the Asian dictatorship, this tragedy is happening without provoking the same international outcry. And after all this, the question remains: did you know that Nicaragua was living under such a harsh dictatorship? Do you think Ortega will be able to stay in power for much longer, or does this regime have an expiration date? And in your opinion, is this really the least free country in the Americas? Tell us what you think in the comments. If you liked the video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next stories. Here at Bello Mundo, we continue to show you the most amazing places on the planet, and also the darkest. See you next time.